Hello. Uh, I'm back with another review. I can't do an intro for a review challenge without it being weird. I need like a designated set of words that I say. Like, hello, this is Chuck Batman, and this is a review of Barbarian. That's the movie we're talking about today. It's Barbarian. For once, okay, I said I would have a not Marvel thing to talk about in my Werewolf by Night review. I was not lying. I had a Halloween party with friends. We watched Werewolf by Night. You check out that video. But we also watched Barbarian, a new, recently released horror movie, like earlier this summer, that is on HBO Max, streaming on HBO Max right now. That I had a very good time with. If you watch the Fear podcast, you might know more of my takes on horror, but I've never really if you watch the Fear podcast, you might have picked up that I'm a little hard to please when it comes to horror. Like, a lot of horror, I'm not really into movies that rely on big scares or gore or, I need my horror movies to either be really tense, atmospheric things or like full on schlock, and stuff that lies in between. Stuff that lies in between is just not good for me. But Barbarian, so I was unsure about Barbarian because I've got some friends who are way more into horror. I always kind of have to be talked into watching a horror movie, and it's not because I'm like afraid. I rarely get like seriously scared by horror. It's just because I don't like the genre that much. I don't. It's one of those genres where I'm kind of like, the cliches of it irritate me, unless I like horror comedies or horror thrillers, but just straight up I like horror comedies or like horror that leans more on the thriller side, as where tension and suspense is the focus. But I'm not a fan of the really the slasher genre, like the slashers or the spooky ghost I'm just pricky. I'm just picky when it comes to the horror genre. So when I say Barbarian is worth your attention, that means something. I just to eat up any horror movie. Barbarian is genuinely really, really good. Here's why. The first thing that really impressed me when I was watching the movie that was I like this movie has great pacing. Most horror movies are too slow for me. Their pacing is just a little too long. They don't get to the point quick enough. They're just kind of slow. And a lot of that is, by design. The design of the genre is not. You don't want a horror movie that you rush a horror movie's pacing too much, and that's how you make it a comedy. That's how you make it horror into comedic. Is mess with the pacing. But this movie, it pulls some interesting narrative tricks to keep things fresh, the pacing fresh, which are kind of spoilers. I'll say this is a movie that's best with very little going in. All you should really know is the basic premise of woman stays at Airbnb with man she hasn't met. Things get weird. But even that premise is not really selling what the movie's really about. That's kind of the starter premise to lead into. I'm trying to figure out how to say this without giving things away. But that's kind of just the starter premise for a movie that goes in some very fun and interesting directions while still having a really a genuinely engaging and a story that actually stuck with me. There's a lot of the messages of this film are very well conveyed, in my opinion. You might be able to tell just from the premise I described, that there's an element of men being scary, man as the barbarian, the monster. But it's a lot more complex than just. It's a much more complex movie than you would think from reading the premise or even watching the first like 15 minutes. So really, like, if you want to give this one a go, it's best to go in blind and don't turn it off if you are getting bored at the if you think you know where it's going and you're not. If you think you know where it's going, you probably don't, and it's worth sticking with it. Ooh, spooky light on over here. The monster's gonna come out of the closet. I don't know, that was distracting me. We're going to keep going now. I'm going to talk about spoilers now. That's going to be our spoiler transition. Transition. If you don't want spoilers, you should have clicked away already. Go watch the movie. I really recommend it. It's got great pacing, great performances, great messages. It's horror with meaning. Film snobs. Whatever. Spoilers, basic spoilers. The premise that I described at the beginning is the premise of the first act, and then the second act flips to this movie is split into 3 pretty distinct sections that are each opened with a, like, shift in perspective of the character you're following, which is very, very interesting, and keeps the movie feeling fresh. Basically, the tense... Is the person the main character is staying with at the Airbnb a sussy killer or not? That kind of thing that when you hear the premise of the movie, you think, oh, that's going to get dragged out for 2 hours. Great. That's just the premise of the first, like, 30 minutes. I'm not sure exactly how long each section was, but there was that whole plotline builds and builds and builds and builds to a monster reveal. And then the movie cuts to something completely different. Tonal shift, new character, location change, and it's jarring at first. It's like, what does this have to do with anything from before? But as it slowly starts to, like, come together, you eventually realize, okay, we're focusing on the owner of the house that was of the Airbnb house. And it's like, okay, now he's gonna get dragged into this plot. But it's like the tone shifts because we're following him. We basically go from following a, like, strong female heroine? Like, heroine. I don't know how to say that word. I guess it would just be heroin, but I just say that and I think of, like, the drug. Or the word harrowing. She's in a harrowing situation, which she is. But it cuts from her. She's like it cuts from her to the kind of horror movie asshole who you root for to get killed in the first 30 minutes. Which is such an interesting, and it cuts in such a way that you don't know. It leaves you wondering, okay, what happened down there? What happened after this monster reveal at the end of the first act? And you're, like, on the edge of your seat waiting to get back to that. But as you're waiting to get back, you're also trying to figure out, okay, how does this new plot line connect with everything that's happened before? It's just so interesting. And then, it also has it does shift to, like, horror comedy when it's focused on this character, because rather than doing that horror movie thing of creating an unlikable character and then trying to make them likable enough that you're rooting for them, but unlikable enough that you're fine with them dying, they just commit to having this guy not self-reflect and repeatedly throw himself. There is a great sequence with him when he is investigating the situation that is one of the funniest, honestly, one of the funniest sequences I've seen. Definitely one of the funniest sequences I've seen in a horror movie. Maybe one of the funniest sequences I've seen. It's a very fun, you'll know the sequence if you've watched it. I'm still being vague about spoilers, just in case you weren't convinced. So I don't want to spoil every plot detail, but in order to talk about the structure of this movie and why it works, you have to go into spoilers. Because you have to reveal, for example, that the male manipulator that the sus man she hasn't met in the first act is a big red herring. And they write that so well, where it's like everything he does in that first act can be explained away as just, like, typical well-meaning male ignorance, or he's a sussy killer guy. Like, it could be either. And you genuinely are like, Okay, I watched that whole act unsure, and they never made me and they never made me think, okay, that's too sus for any normal person to do, or that's not, like, that's too nice for any killer to do. Everything had a veneer of, like, this could genuinely 50-50 go either way. Uh, and I like this. It's like each. I think this is where the theming of the movie comes in. Each male character that is introduced is like more and more depraved than the last. We start with well-meaning, if slightly creepy, Airbnb roommate played by Bill Skarsgård, which is great casting. He's like the horror movie creepy man guy. He played the clown in It. He played Pennywise. So it's like you see him, and you're expecting him to be like creepy. So when he's just but he's just like a relatively normal, well-meaning guy who is maybe slightly creepy, maybe has some male ignorance, like when the girl tells him that there's something sus going on, he kind of like doesn't believe it and is like, I need to see for myself, and that's basically what gets him killed. Spoiler alert, again. We're into spoiler territory here. If this movie sounds interesting to you by this point, please leave. I don't need you to watch the rest of the video. I don't care. But then we cut to the next guy, who the owner of the Airbnb, the focus of the second act, who is a a rapist. I don't. There's no good way to like trigger warning that, but that's it. It does. It's like that is it, and it doesn't like make light of that or trivial. I said that act's comedy. It's comedy in the way that they know he's awful, and they make him like it's comedy. It's like in The Boys, how the Deep does that really terrible sexually harassing thing at the very beginning of season 1, and then the show ever since then has just made him a complete clown. It's that same principle of like, you can have a character who does very real, very awful stuff, and if they just get clowned on in the whole script, that's fun. That's funny to watch. It's funny to watch him get clowned on, and it's funny to watch his own like overconfidence and ego and unwillingness to listen to others bite him in the ass in this scenario. Honestly, he survives way longer than he should, but he doesn't survive. At the end of the day, he gets his comeuppance. And then the final man that we meet, the start of the third act, is a jump back to the original owner of the house. And they've been, for the whole movie, there's these sus basements underneath the house, and it's not just that there's a monster in those sus basements, there's also clear evidence of, and this is where the very real element kicks in, of like, there's like creepy rooms with a camera and a bed and like cages, all this sus stuff that implies someone kidnapping people and bringing them down here. Very, very dark stuff. And what this flashback does at the start of the third act is it establishes the original owner of the house, and it's a very good sequence of showing him like, it doesn't get too like graphic, but it gives you just enough to be like, oh, so he's where this all started. And he's so awful that when the rapist character, the second male introduced, comes across one of his like his awful videotapes, the original house owner, he's like, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? It's like, even for this guy who's already an awful person, this other dude's at another level. So it's like each male character sinks more down into depravity, and the monster of the movie is not the scary creature. The creature is basically another victim of the barbarian mindset. The title of the movie I really like, because I feel like barbarian, it's a very specific word which refers to a very kind of animalistic masculinity that is like that is clearly what the movie is trying to comment on. Not to, like toxic masculinity at the surface level, but going deeper than that all the way down to like true like barbarian, like where does the civilized but bad person end, and at what point are you just like a human monster, a male monster? At what point is the toxic masculinity literally like lacking in humanity? Because it's like the first man is, he has some toxic masculine traits, but he's generally a good guy. The second man you meet is a full-on toxic male, but he's still a human character with human flaws. And then the third man you meet is like the kidnap women and take them to his basement, like horrible, irredeemable, like awful shitbag of a person, bottom of the barrel, and centering the movie on like having that scenario be like a big part of the premise of the movie, but then like jumping forward, and it's just a good way of like it touches on a real and terrifying thing that has unfortunately happened in the real world, but then adds just enough fantastical to it that you can still have fun watching a horror movie and not. But the narrative theming of it sticks with you afterward. I found the narrative part as much fun as I had watching it. I also had fun sort of thinking about the movie. I don't know if fun's the right word, but I enjoyed thinking about the movie later and like how all its themes kind of tied together to create this message. And the message is a lot more nuanced than man bad. It was more like the flaws of masculinity contrasted with the fact that the main character wins because they're like their selflessness and their survival skills that the other male characters don't have because of their toxic traits. It's just a very well structured, well written, well put together movie. I know the reception of it online has been kind of mixed, and it's mostly just those like tone shifts. The structure of I loved the like shifting structure thing where each act was like its own sort of almost story reset to then get. I will say the third act is the least strong act because it's one of those movies where the payoff is not quite as satisfying as the build up, but the third act still works, and the third act the third act is just a little more typical horror movie with the characters we've been introduced to fighting to get their way out of the bad situation. The whole third act is not the flashback. I feel like I should make that clear. But overall, I don't know if the movie's still in theaters, but if it is, go see it in theaters, watch it on HBO Max, whatever you want to do. This is a movie you should watch if you have any interest in the genre. Honestly, the only reason I wouldn't watch this movie is there is, as you can tell from what I've talked about in the review, there's some trigger warnings that come like attached to it. If like subjects of like rape, sexual harassment, those kinds of things. If that's a subject you aren't comfortable with, if that's a subject you aren't comfortable with, there's not any like graphic scenes in it or anything in that way, but it's just a subject that if you're not comfortable with that being discussed in the movie, you won't want to watch the movie. That's fine. Hell, if you're not comfortable with those things being discussed, you might have already clicked off this video. I don't know. Anyway, go see Barbarian. I enjoyed it. It was a good time. Good horror movie. More horror movies like this. Maybe not specifically structured like this, but like just more horror movies with these kinds of like themes that are really focused on like that really like care about their characters and not just big monsters scary. Ooh. Like I don't know. I just really, really liked it. I was very impressed. If you have any recommendations of like other horror movies with a similar vibe, you horror heads out there, if you've movie recommendations of horror movies that capture a similar energy to Barbarian and are of the same level of quality, feel free to shoot those recommendations in the comments. I'll be lucky if I get one comment, one recommendation, honestly. Anyway, arrivederci!